Good afternoon. My name is Tamara Martin, and I am the director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual program, A President Resigns 50 Years Later. On August 8, 1974, at 9:01 p.m., President Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office at the White House, announcing his resignation effective at noon the following day. In his speech, he said, "I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interest of America first." Today's program will look at President Nixon's decision to resign and final days in the White House. Panelists will provide firsthand accounts and reference historic documents to share insight into the peaceful transition of power under difficult circumstances. The program will also discuss how the Nixon Presidential Materials Collection came to the National Archives, as well as how research and perspectives on this day in American history have changed over the past 50 years. To start our program, I would like to introduce Kara Blond, who is the executive for Presidential Libraries, and she will provide you with our introductory remarks.
Thanks, Tamara, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kara Blond. As Tamara said, I am the executive for Presidential Libraries here at the National Archives. And on behalf of our whole team, welcome to today's program, A President Resigns 50 Years Later. This event is actually part of our Presidential Libraries Presents series, which features diverse programming that's focused on the history and legacy of the American presidency. The Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California, is just one of the National Archives' 15 presidential libraries and museums across the country, representing the administrations of Herbert Hoover through Donald Trump. The presidential libraries help us explore the American experience, bringing together the documents and artifacts of each presidential administration, and then providing access to researchers and public audiences. Through our nonpartisan lens, the libraries and museums sit at this really interesting intersection of American history and culture and civic education and engagement. So today we mark the 50th anniversary of a historic moment in our nation's story. It was 50 years ago today, August 8th, that President Nixon, under immense personal and political pressure, made the decision to place the country over the personal and resign the presidency. In his resignation speech, Nixon said, "By taking this action, I hope I will have hastened the start of that process of healing, which is so desperately needed in America." Today's conversation will focus on the documents from the collection at the Nixon Library and Museum, and our remarkable panelists are going to offer their perspective on President Nixon's resignation and its legacy now 50 years later. A big thanks to each of our speakers for participating in today's discussion, and a special thank you to those of you who are joining us virtually or watching at the Gerald Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan, or the National Archives Theater here in Washington, D.C. I would now like to hand it back to Nixon Library Director Tamara Martin, who will introduce our moderator. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kara. And now I would like to introduce our distinguished moderator, Alan Lowe. Alan is the Executive Director of the American Museum of Science and Energy and the K-25 Atomic History Center. He has a long career in presidential libraries, previously serving in leadership roles at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. Alan is dedicated to preserving historical legacies and advancing knowledge in science and engineering. He also hosts the American POTUS podcast and serves on multiple advisory boards. Alan is a member of the Oak Ridge Rotary and has received recognition for his contributions to the field, including being inducted into the University of Kentucky Alumni Hall of Fame. And now over to Alan, who will introduce our panelists and begin today's discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Tamara. Thank you. I always say I love that University of Kentucky element. It irritates everyone here in Tennessee, but I'm very proud of that. So thank you, Tamara. Thank you, everyone. I'm so honored to be part of this discussion today. I want to thank everyone at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, Tamara, the whole staff there, my friend Greg Cumming, for hosting this program and allowing me to be part of it. I think few men have impacted our nation like Richard Nixon, with a long career of public service and great accomplishment it can be well said that the story of the 20th century in politics and in diplomacy in America really is the story of Richard Nixon. If we overlook that, I think we're doing a disservice to our nation, to the discipline of history, and indeed to the man himself. But there's no denying that the end of President Nixon's storied public service career was one of controversy and sorrow for himself and indeed for the nation. Of course, we know now that he rebuilt himself yet again in the aftermath of Watergate. But the event we're here today to discuss, his resignation from the presidency and what preceded it, cannot be forgotten in that story either. We must examine that history, have to learn from it, give it new perspectives. 50 years on, I think there's still much that we can learn and to be discussed. And we're going to do that today. Today, we've gathered this great panel that will first provide some remarks, and then we'll have a discussion amongst them framed on two related themes. How did Richard Nixon approach the resignation from a political and personal perspective at that time and later in his life? And how can researchers today learn about this time in history and its ramifications that continue to this very moment through using the vast archives at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library? Now, to do that, we're joined by four terrific panelists who will all begin, as I said, with remarks before we have some general discussion framed by a couple of questions. We're going to start with Mr. Frank Gannon. Frank was a member of the Nixon White House staff, and he was with President Nixon on Air Force One as he flew to California after the resignation. In the post-presidency, Frank organized the research and writing of the president's memoirs. He's going to start us off today with his recollections of the president's personal thoughts upon resignation. Frank?
Alan, thank you, and greetings to all from a soggy, muggy day here on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. Tamara asked me to do sort of show and tell about what I observed and experienced in those fateful days in August of 1974. I'll be using some photos from the archives and some excerpts from 38 hours of interviews I did with President Nixon back in 1983. 50 years ago today, on Thursday, August 8th, 1974, White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, my boss, announced that the president would address the nation at 9 p.m. That afternoon, Ron sent me to the Oval Office to observe the preparation for the speech. As you'll see there, papers were put down to protect the carpet as the technicians brought in lights, cameras, and other equipment. The Wilson desk's glass top was covered with a brown beige cloth, and a blue curtain covered the windows and the credenza with its framed photographs and bust of Lincoln. It was assumed that the president would announce his resignation in the speech, but only a handful of people knew for sure what he was going to do because he purposely kept his intentions secret. 4 days earlier, on Monday, Ron had taken me aside, sworn me to secrecy, and asked if the president were to decide to resign, would I go to San Clemente for a month to help organize a transition? I said I would, and he said to have a suitcase packed if it turned out to be needed. I discovered that he had had the same conversation with his assistant, Diane Sawyer, and with one of the press office secretaries, Ann Greer. The next photo is one I call Death Watch. Shows Ron, Diane, and me in Ron's office about an hour before the speech would be given. After midnight, as I was getting ready to go home, I ran into a friend, a Secret Service uniformed policeman. He said that if I wanted to take a last look at the Oval Office, it would be open for a couple of hours before they ran a complete security sweep for the new president. It was an eerie experience. The first floor of the West Wing was completely deserted, and the door to the Oval Office was wide open. I went in, I walked behind the desk, I sat in the president's chair for a minute or so, just trying to wrap my mind around the whole surreal situation. A few hours in the morning, after a few hours of fitful sleep, a White House car arrived to take me out to Andrews. Before continuing with that Friday morning, I'd like to cover a bit of backstory. 2 days before, on Wednesday, August 7th, 3 Republican leaders, Senator Hugh Scott, Congressman John Rhodes, and the 1964 standard bearer, Barry Goldwater, came to the White House. They were bringing bad news, although, of course, it wasn't news to the president. They reported that his support had essentially evaporated, and impeachment by the House and conviction by the Senate were all but certain. Outside the West Wing, the 3 leaders told reporters They had accomplished the purpose of the meeting, which was to convey the dire situation on the Hill. They hadn't recommended resignation, and the president hadn't raised it. Because he resigned the next day, the meeting with the congressional leaders immediately assumed almost mythic status as the reason, or at least the tipping point, that made him decide to resign. Today, 50 years later, that interpretation is the conventional wisdom. But this conventional wisdom gets it wrong. In typical Nixon style, his resignation involved a complex subtext that required great skill, subtlety, self-discipline, and absolute secrecy. In fact, his resignation clock had started ticking exactly 2 weeks, 15 days earlier in San Clemente on July 23rd. That was the day he learned he lost the support of 3 influential Southern Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee. That meant impeachment by the House, followed by a trial in the Senate, was inevitable. He turned to General Haig, his chief of staff, and said, "Well, Al, there goes the presidency." And that's when he decided to resign. Then, the very next day, July 24th, the resignation timeframe narrowed down to a couple of weeks at most because the Supreme Court published its unanimous decision in U.S. v. Nixon, requiring the president to turn over all the Watergate-related tapes subpoenaed by the special prosecutor. That would include the conversation that became known as the smoking gun, where he approved a plan to have the CIA tell the FBI to call off the Watergate investigation. He thought the conversation, properly construed and seen in context, was defensible. But in that summer's superheated political atmosphere, he knew its release would be devastating. In 1983, in interviews with me, he summed up the situation when he flew back to Washington on July 31st. I think we have a video of that. There it is.
So as you flew back to Washington from San Clemente, you had no hope whatever that you would survive as president for more than a matter of days or weeks or months at most?
From the 23rd of July on, I knew that we could not survive. However, when I got back to Washington, in my usual methodical way, people think it's methodical, and I guess it is, I decided I should put down the pros and cons of what options I had. And I had a sheet of paper on that which refreshed my memory. Rather interesting when I read it today, so many years later. It indicated, 1, I could resign now. 2, I could wait until the House voted impeachment and resign then. Or 3, I could, despite the House voting impeachment, go to trial in the Senate, which would take about 6 months. Now, resigning now was the option I didn't want to do above everything else, personally. I'm a fighter. I just didn't want to quit. Also, I thought it would be an admission of guilt, which of course it was. And also, I felt that it would set a terribly bad precedent for the future. I hope no other president ever resigns under any circumstances. The second option was no option at all, to wait until the House voted impeachment, because what I would do then would be to put all of my good supporters on the spot and make them vote for impeachment, which they didn't want to do. You don't put them through that sort of thing. The third option, go through the Senate with a hearing, a trial, I should say, for 6 months. I knew that that was unacceptable. Unacceptable because from the standpoint of the country couldn't afford to have a crippled, half-time president. Particularly in this time when I recalled that in 1973, when things weren't as bad as they were now, the Soviet Union at that time was very difficult during that 73 war in the Mideast. I just couldn't risk it, I felt. So after making those notes, I, in my own mind, decided, well, there's no choice. And so the next day, on the first day of August, this was a week before I finally made my resignation speech, I got in Haig and Ziegler, and I told them that I felt that there was no choice but to resign.
So the congressional leaders meeting on that Wednesday, August 7th, far from being the reason Nixon decided to resign, was one of the many boxes he had been conscientiously ticking as part of the elaborate, orderly, and dignified process he had put in place to prepare himself, his family, his supporters, the nation, and the world for his resignation. Among the other boxes to be ticked was a cabinet meeting on the 6th. There were meetings with different supporters, like the Vietnam POWs, Rabbi Baruch Korf, Bruce Hershenson. By far the most difficult box for him to tick was his family. They unanimously opposed and passionately argued against resignation. On this Wednesday evening, the family, joined by Rose Woods, who was essentially part of the family, gathered in the third floor solarium. The president had asked White House photographer Ollie Atkins to stop by. I think we have a photo of Ollie, who was an important figure. He had joined the Nixon campaign in 1968 and became very close to the family. But this night he wasn't welcomed with great enthusiasm. And Mrs. Nixon particularly didn't think the photographs were appropriate. But the president said they had to do it for history and for themselves. He said, someday we will be able to talk about this night, and then we will want to remember everything about it. To break the ice, Ollie snapped photos of the president with Tricia and Vicky, the poodle, and another with Rose. For photo, Tricia suggested that they all form a line, the way they had done in one of their favorites, taken in the Blue Room at Christmas of 1971. In 1983, the president recalled this scene from the solarium.
I told Ollie that I would, that we would have the picture, and I put on somewhat of a false front and bravado and tried to arrange it in my usual way. You stand here, stand accordion-like so that you won't be cut out of the picture. And Ollie mercifully was quick because we were all uptight. Tears were brimming in virtually everybody's eyes. Then, after he snapped that picture, Julie just couldn't hold in the tears any longer. She rushed over to me and threw her arms around me and said, "I love you so much, Daddy." Well, by that time, I couldn't say much either.
Later that night, Nixon asked Henry Kissinger to come to the Lincoln sitting room. They discussed the letters being sent and the calls being made to foreign leaders, informing them of the resignation, more boxes to be ticked, more tickable boxes. They recalled the happier evenings that had taken place in the Lincoln sitting room. At one point, the president walked down to the family kitchen and returned with a bottle of Courvoisier that had been a Christmas gift in 1970, I think, 1971. He opened the bottle and they toasted the invitation to China that had just arrived. Incidentally, in San Clemente in April of 1977, the president brought out that same bottle of Courvoisier to toast with Diane Sawyer and me the completion of his memoirs. The next morning, Thursday the 8th, he vetoed an agriculture subsidies bill so President Ford wouldn't have to begin his administration on a down note. And then at 11 o'clock, he met with the vice president. The meeting was brief. He urged Ford to keep Kissinger at state and to keep Haig as chief of staff for at least a while. As Ford was leaving, Nixon mentioned the phone call that he had received from President Eisenhower the night before his inauguration in 1969. Ike said, "I only have one regret. This is the last time I can call you Dick, Mr. President." And Nixon said, "This is the last time I can call you Jerry, Mr. President." Around noon, as usual, his lunch arrived. A creature of habit without much interest in food, it was always variations on a theme. Cottage cheese with pineapple slices or cottage cheese with ketchup and pepper. That afternoon, Robert Knutson, one of the White House photographers, realized that this otherwise mundane meal would be the last of its kind, and he snapped a picture. That evening, President Nixon ticked the last two boxes on the resignation timetable. At 7:30 in his EOB office, he officially informed the bipartisan congressional leadership that he intended to resign the presidency. And then he went from there, just before his speech, to the cabinet room to meet with some of his closest House and Senate supporters and friends, the majority of whom were Democrats. In one of my 1983 interviews, the president described how Friday, August 9th, 50 years ago tomorrow, that final day began.
Went to bed, didn't sleep very well, and I woke up with a start the next morning, the last day, wondering if I'd overslept, and I looked at my watch. It was only 4 o'clock. Well, I tossed and turned, then I got up, and I walked into the kitchen. Thought I'd get a bite to eat. And Johnny Johnson, one of the White House butler, was there. And I said, "Johnny, what are you doing here so early?" He said, "Isn't early, Mr. President." He said, "It's almost 6 o'clock. And I looked at my watch. As a matter of fact, it's the same watch I have on here. And it's one of those watches, you know, with a battery in. It's supposed to run for 2 years. The battery had run out, worn out, at 4 o'clock, the last day I was in office. By that time, I was worn out, too. So in the event, I had Johnny, I said, "Johnny, I'm going to have something different. This is about the only really different thing that I did that day from my usual habit. Usually, I have a very simple breakfast. For years, I would just have orange juice, cereal, and a glass of milk, or papaya cereal and a glass of milk. That's all I had, the same thing, day after day for 5.5 years. Because I'm not supposed to have eggs because of high cholesterol or some foolish reason, and so forth and so on. So, Johnny, I want you to fix me one of my favorite dishes." And so what he did was to make up some corned beef hash with poached eggs. I must say it was a little too heavy for me to eat much of it, but I enjoyed having it. Went back down to the Lincoln Room, and Al Haig sort of knocked on the door. I think it was perhaps for him the most difficult meeting we had, and for me it wasn't easy. He brought one piece of paper. There was one line on it. He said, "You know, we forgot to do this. Would you sign it now? I hereby resign the office of President of the United States." I signed it. He took it out.
Last August, only a few months before he died, I was able to spend a couple of hours interviewing President Nixon's Marine military aide and later Chief of Staff and longtime friend, Colonel Jack Brennan. Jack takes up the story of that Friday morning. And by the way, this is a Lunch and Learn exclusive. This is the first time this video is being seen publicly.
So I went up the elevator. Steve and I went up the elevator this time. So he's saying goodbye to the working staff, the people who cleaned the bedrooms and cooked and all that. They're all in tears, all crying. They love the family, maybe mostly Mrs. Nixon, but everyone was screaming, crying. And so we get on the elevator, and I said, or I think Steve said, "Mr. President, when you get in the East Room, the cameras are to your left front." And Mrs. Nixon said, "What cameras? Who authorized camera press?" And he said, "I did." And she didn't say anything. So anyway, off the elevator, and I said, "Just stand right here." And I went and got the microphone, and almost tearfully, you still can hear it, announced. And I didn't just say President of the United States. If you're overseas or some from another country, you say "of America." So I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America, Mrs. Nixon, Mrs. Julie," the whole family I introduced.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America and Mrs. Nixon, Mr. and Mrs. David Eisenhower, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Cox.
And then into the East Room, and he spoke, and I didn't sit. I just stood facing him, in case you want anything. And so when his talk was over, then I started walking out with him, and everyone was saying, "Take care of him, Jack, take care of him, Jack." Yeah.
At Andrews, aside from the Air Force crew and Navy stewards and a basic Secret Service detachment, Air Force One, the big Boeing 707, was essentially empty. Jack Brennan arrived on Army One. The other 6 staff members aboard, Ron Ziegler, Steve Bull, Gene Bull, Ann Greer, Diane Sawyer, and me, had all arrived much earlier. Diane and I had watched the East Room farewell on a small portable TV set in the president's private cabin. When it was wheels up at 10:17, the president would still be president for about another 90 minutes. Diane and I were seated across a table from Ron Ziegler. Suddenly the phone next to my seat rang, and the White House operator announced, "Mr. Haldeman is calling for President Nixon." The formerly fearsome chief of staff was wasting no time making an 11th hour Hail Mary plea for a pardon. Nixon had already rejected the idea, but Haldeman was facing hard times, so he had nothing to lose by pitching it again. I passed the phone across to Ron. He said he was sorry, but the president couldn't be disturbed, said goodbye, and handed it back to me. A little later, the president walked back to the staff cabin. He thanked each of us for our work in the White House and for agreeing to come to San Clemente. When I told him how powerful and moving I thought his East Room farewell had been, he shrugged and said, "Not really up to your Churchill standards, I'm afraid." He knew that in graduate school in England, I had worked on the official life of Sir Winston Churchill, and he had called me a couple of times to confirm research or Churchill quotes. We were 37,000 feet above Jefferson City, Missouri at 12:05 when Gerald Ford was sworn in as our 37th president, and Air Force One's call sign was changed to SAM 27,000, Special Air Mission 27,000. Later on, the now former president came back to the staff cabin again. He joked that with no press aboard, the plane smelled a lot better. Once again, he thanked us for joining him. After we landed, I drove with Ron down the freeway to San Clemente. At the Casa Pacifica, the Nixons' home, the living room was empty. Ron went to see where everyone was, so I was alone there when the phone rang. I picked up the receiver and heard a very recognizable voice saying, "Hello, this is Ronald Reagan. I'm calling to welcome the President and Mrs. Nixon home to California." Over the next 2 decades, their relations had some ups and downs, but Richard Nixon never forgot the empathy and elegance of that phone call. And that's what I was doing 50 years ago today.
Frank, that's truly an amazing story. I think, we always have to remember that the men and women in public service, Richard Nixon being among them, are men and women. They're flesh and blood. They have emotions. They're not images or stereotypes or symbols. They're real people. And you gave us an amazing glimpse at the man on that very, very terrible and traumatic time for him.
In our introductory film at the library, Evan Thomas says, "History is made by humans. Nixon was intensely human."
That's very, very true. And I thank you also for that first look at the video. That was tremendous history being recorded right there.
Jack is missed.
So continuing with remarks, for many years, as you heard, I was so fortunate to work at the National Archives and Records Administration. I really believe in that agency's mission to preserve and make available what I always called the raw material of history. If you really want to understand history, if you really want to understand the Nixon administration, the Nixon story, you need to go and dive into those archives. The Nixon archives are an incredible resource to tell an incredible story. So now to tell us a bit of that story, we're joined by the Nixon Presidential Library's Supervisory Archivist, Jason Schultz. Jason?
Thank you, Alan. It's hard to follow up Frank's front row seat to history, but through our archival holdings, maybe we have a second row seat. And those holdings have had a unique history, even by the standards of presidential records. At the National Archives, we're the nation's record keeper. At the Nixon Library, our archival collection has approximately 46 million pages of textual records, hundreds of thousands of photographs, and thousands of hours of audio, video, and film recordings, including the famous White House tapes. And the core of our holdings are very much the Nixon presidential materials. When Richard Nixon resigned from office, he set in motion a new era of presidential records. Stretching back to George Washington, materials created by the president were always considered his personal property for him to do with as he wished when he left office. The National Archives was established during Franklin Roosevelt's administration, and he was the first president to donate his materials to it, thereby establishing the presidential library system. This was codified in 1955 by the Presidential Libraries Act. Upon leaving office then, Nixon was under no obligation to donate the materials to the government based on these past practices. The Ford administration did take temporary possession of the presidential materials, while Attorney General William Saxby wrote an opinion on ownership of them. He concluded that the papers and materials in question were the property of Richard M. Nixon when his term of office ended. Following this opinion, Nixon signed a depository agreement with Arthur F. Sampson, who was head of the General Services Administration, under which the National Archives was then a part. Under this Nixon-Sampson agreement, Nixon retained title to the materials, but he agreed to deposit them with the General Services Administration. Nixon couldn't withdraw any document for 3 years, but after this time, he was free to retain them himself or to donate them. For the tapes, this was 5 years, after which Nixon could destroy any or all of them. And in any event, the tapes were all to be destroyed after 10 years or upon Nixon's death, whichever occurred first. This agreement and the outcry from the public about it propelled Congress to pass and President Gerald Ford to sign into law the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act, or PRMPA as we call it, in December of 1974. This act seized the presidential materials and mandated that the General Services Administration submit to each House of Congress a set of proposed regulations describing procedures for processing and providing public access to the Nixon presidential materials in its possession. As a footnote, the way all this played out eventually led to the creation of the Presidential Records Act in 1978, which went into effect with the Reagan administration and established that presidential records were government records from the time of creation. And this is the law that continues to govern them. The passage of PRMPA resulted in more than 2 decades of litigation over the Nixon material. Although President Nixon and his lawyers argued in a suit filed against the government that the materials were his property and that the processing of them by the National Archives violated his constitutional rights, the Supreme Court upheld PRMPA in a 1977 decision, Nixon v. Administrator. The White House counsel's office then formally transferred custody and control over the Nixon presidential materials to the National Archives on June 29, 1977. To process the materials, though, the implementing regulations defining what was returnable still needed to be approved by Congress. A crucial part of this was establishing that some materials were private and personal or private and political. That is, they weren't related to Nixon's constitutional and statutory duties as president. Whereas with donated presidential materials before Nixon, the former president, chose what to donate and the deed could specify further restrictions. With the Nixon presidential materials, everything was seized and archivists would need to review, segregate, and return some materials. So this was a new paradigm for reviewing presidential archival materials. And while the textual documents weren't without their challenges, and I'll have more on that in a minute, the White House tapes required a wholly new approach. Nixon wasn't the first president to record himself in office, but the collection is unique in its size and scope. And like the other archival materials, the tapes needed to be reviewed and portions restricted for things like privacy, national security, or being private and returnable. To accomplish this, after creating a preservation copy, archivists had to listen to thousands of hours of recordings, in the process creating subject logs for each of these conversations, including when and where the conversation occurred, who the participants were, and incredibly detailed lists of the topics discussed. The subject logs totaled 27,000 pages when complete. And this work required extensive use of the president's daily diary and other archival materials to establish who was in certain meetings and what they were about. I don't have nearly enough time to talk to you about all of the nuances of the tape's history and processing, but if you're interested, that history is in our finding aid on our website at nixonlibrary.gov. In August of 2013, the library released the last portion of tapes that had not yet been made public, and re-review continues today on portions previously restricted. So PRMPA mandated that those materials related to abuses of governmental power needed to be processed and made available first. On the textual side, National Archives staff determined that these would most likely be found in the White House special files. The White House Central Files Unit, now known as the White House Office of Records Management, was a permanent organization in the White House to assist with filing and retrieval of the vast amounts of paperwork generated by the presidency. In 1972, the Nixon administration established a parallel special files unit where more sensitive materials, either for national security or political sensitivity, would be stored. These included files of the president's closest staff, like H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, and the president's office files and personal files. The processing work we do for a textual collection entails first gaining control over it with a folder title list and reviewing any background files we might have. After we determine the arrangement, we then rehouse the materials to get them into asset-free folders and asset-free boxes, and then archivists undertake a page-by-page review to determine if anything needs to be restricted for agency policy or statute, national security, personal privacy, trade secrets, investigatory information, returnable due to personal reasons, or non-historical. And then the withdrawals need to be appropriately segregated. At this time, we also identify audiovisual materials and museum items and get those to the appropriate places. And the page-by-page review also gives the processing archivist the opportunity to understand the details of the collection, who created it, who are the most frequent correspondents, what subjects are covered, what time period were the materials created, and any other information that reflects their creation and use. And then the archivist synthesizes this information into a finding aid, which describes the creator, whether that be an office or a person, the materials, and includes a folder title list. So under the law, when materials were proposed for release, Nixon could object to that release, and then a Presidential Materials Review Board would make the determination as to what should be returned to Nixon and what should be retained by the National Archives. So when the special files were proposed for release in 1987, Nixon objected to the release of approximately 42,000 documents, which became known as the contested materials. The Presidential Materials Review Board commenced its review in May of 1988, and in July of 1996 returned approximately 8,900 private political and private personal documents to the estate of Richard Nixon. The remaining documents were retained by the National Archives and either opened or closed under one of our restriction categories. While the National Archives was processing and making materials available through the Nixon Presidential Materials staff in the Washington, D.C. area, the private Nixon Foundation established the Nixon Library and Birthplace here in Yorba Linda, California in 1990, and opened a private research room with reference service on collections it owned, primarily pre-presidential materials. In the early 2000s, serious efforts began to bring the private Nixon Library and Birthplace into the federal system. This first required an act of Congress to remove the provision in PRIMPA that the presidential materials had to remain within the Washington, D.C. area, and this was accomplished in 2004. Archivist of the United States, Alan Weinstein, made the Federal Nixon Library a priority upon him assuming office in 2005. July 11, 2007 saw the establishment of that federal Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum through a joint operating agreement between the National Archives and the Nixon Foundation. At the same time, the Nixon Foundation deeded significant holdings to the National Archives. The Committee for the Re-election of the President collection from the 1972 re-election campaign, the contested materials I talked about before, other materials returned to the president as private and personal, and the Foundation's interest in the private political category. So this meant that when we perform access review on archival materials now, we no longer need to return those materials that are solely political in nature. When the Federal Library opened in 2007, it offered reference services in our research room on materials available in the former private research room, as well as pre-presidential materials that Nixon had donated to the National Archives at the beginning of his presidency. The government constructed an addition to the library to house the presidential materials, which were at Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. And I was part of a group that moved that collection in 2010, sending 21 53-foot trailers across the country over the course of 2 months. After a temporary closure to accommodate the move, we reopened the Yorba Linda Research Room on July 1st, 2010. And for the first time, a researcher studying Nixon could find the most important materials about him and his political career all in one place. And since that time, we've continued with the Archive's mission to preserve and make these materials accessible through continued review of holdings and providing reference support services by responding to researcher inquiries and operating a very busy research room in Yorba Linda. So I mentioned our continued processing work. 50 years out, sensitivity has decreased, but we're not so far out that we can get away from a page-by-page review. In July of 2023, we opened the staff member and office files for the White House Advance Office and Donald Rumsfeld, with over 275,000 pages between the two of them. Last September, we had one of our biggest declassification openings in almost 20 years, with the release of approximately 90,000 pages. And just like Frank had something new to share, I'm announcing for the first time today that tomorrow we'll have another big declassification release with over 30,000 pages. Materials are going to come from the Vietnam Country Files, Henry Kissinger Noon and Evening Notes, Situation Room Logs, and for the very first time from the National Security Council Far East Country Files, including Laos and Thailand. So whether you've never come to the library to do archival research or whether you've already thanked us in a book, I invite you to come visit because we've never had more records available to you.
Wow, Jason, that's an amazing announcement. I want to come out and look at those records immediately. What phenomenal archives are there in Yorba Linda. So thank you. You know, I started my career as a very young archivist at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, then in LA up in Simi Valley, and was among the first archivists trained in that Presidential Records Act you discussed. So believe me, I could talk to you for another couple hours on those. But I know we have other topics to go to here. But thank you so much for that really fascinating look at the Nixon presidential materials. So, you know, one reason records are preserved is to make them available to terrific researchers. And we're fortunate to have a scholar today with us, Garrett Graff, who's the author of a really great new book, Watergate, A New History. You'd think that after 50 plus years, it'd be hard to give a new history of an event that's gathered so much attention from scholars here and around the world. But Garrett did just that, in part by finding those unexpected stories in the Nixon archives. So with that, Garrett Graff.
Alan, thanks so much. As you said, Richard Nixon was one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century. You know, judged on paper and resume alone, he would stand among the giants who occupied the White House at any time in the 20th century. As a young congressman, he, of course, helped fuel the Red Scare and give life to McCarthyism, turning communism into a career-ending slur. And from 1952 to 1972, he was on the Republican national presidential ticket 5 times, a record equaled in the 20th century only by FDR himself. When he ascended to the presidency in 1968 and 1969, he shaped, reshaped, escalated, prolonged, and eventually wound down the Vietnam War. He signed the Clean Air Act and created the EPA. He created OSHA, transformed the post office into a quasi-private government enterprise, hiked Social Security payments, declared war on cancer, took the U.S. off the gold standard, signed Title IX, transformed the military by ending the draft. He brought more than 1,000 women into the middle management of the U.S. government, into previously male-occupied management roles, and brought the first ever female military aides to the White House. Internationally, of course, he averted a larger war in the Middle East amid the Yom Kippur War. He calmed the Cold War, brought détente with the Soviet Union, signed arms control treaties, reopened diplomatic relations with China. He was the first president to visit a communist country, the first to visit Beijing, the first to stand in Moscow. In an era when the news weeklies dominated American life, Richard Nixon, across his career, was on the cover of Time magazine a total of 55 times, more than a year's worth of news magazines, more than any other figure in history. He was effectively, I think, the hinge upon the hinge upon which almost the entire American century turned, the figure who ushered out the expansive liberal consensus of the New Deal and the Great Society. And yet, when we think about Richard Nixon today, all of that legacy, domestic and foreign, is overshadowed by the one-word scandal that would ultimately lead to the first congressional impeachment hearings in a century and force him from office 50 years ago. This was a topic, as Alan noted in introducing me, that I dove into to try to assemble a new telling for my book, Watergate, A New History, which came out 2 years ago for the 50th anniversary of that original break-in on June 17th, 1972. As part of that, I got to dive into some of these archives and look back at these documents. I've been lucky enough across my career to have had the chance to conduct research variously at the Truman Library, the Eisenhower Library, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton, the presidential libraries. And I just find them incredible national treasures. Every year I joke that when I write that check to the IRS on April 15th, I like to pretend that all of it goes to funding our presidential libraries. Because to me, what you see in these documents is you can watch history come alive. I had this almost electric moment that I talk about in talks about my book of paging through the presidential daily diaries. You saw a photo of them earlier, that these are the documents that track day by day sort of every meeting and telephone call that the president has. You know, who walks into the Oval Office at what time and who walks out, how long a telephone lasts, whether it was the president calling or someone calling the president. And of course, in a presidential administration, the most valuable resource that you have, the only truly finite resource in the US government, is the physical presence and time of the President of the United States. It's fixed by the Constitution and something that every president is keenly aware of dwindling minute by minute, hour by hour across their four-year term. In the spring of 1974, though, in paging through these presidential daily diaries, you can actually watch page by page, day by day, week by week, as Watergate consumes Richard Nixon's presidency. For longer and longer periods, as he is listening to these tapes, trying to transcribe them, trying to figure out what path he might have forward politically, he retreats both from the Oval Office into his executive hideaway in the old executive office building, and then even into Camp David and San Clemente to listen to these tapes and stew. On Monday, April 22nd, you see in these presidential daily diaries, the official record of his day noted just 2 telephone calls, each just 1 minute long, a total of 2 minutes of presidential work in an entire 24-hour day. The next day, between the hours of 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., his schedule records only a single 4-minute telephone call to Henry Kissinger. Friday, Nixon had just 5 telephone calls totaling 12 minutes between 9 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. before leaving for Camp David, where he then spent Saturday and Sunday fully immersed in the final editing of the transcripts of what was going to be, he thought, the first and he hoped only release of transcripts from those White House tapes. But as he listened to those tapes, he knew that he was in trouble. As he wrote in his memoirs, quote, "It is not possible to describe what it is like to see long-forgotten conversations appear as lengthy transcripts. When the words of an ordinary conversation are put on paper, they acquire a rigidity that, despite a literal accuracy of terms of what was said, undermines, may completely fail to capture or reflect the nature of the meeting or conversation as it actually took place." Those tapes and transcripts would, of course, be the end of his presidency in August. 50 years later, we now recognize Watergate in many ways as the dividing line between old Washington and new, capturing a sea change in power, institutional dynamics, and politics in Washington. Watergate stands simultaneously as the last event of an old era, when segregationists ruled Capitol Hill and World War I veterans still walked its hallways, and when the city's rhythms were driven by print newspaper deadlines. And the introduction, too, of a new generation of political action, sweeping up some of the biggest names in our 21st century, from future actor and Senator Fred Thompson to journalist Diane Sawyer, to a young, bespectacled Hillary Rodham, to a young Roger Stone, who got his first taste of dirty tricks on the national scale amid Nixon's 72 campaign. It ushered into Washington in 1974 more than 50 new Democratic lawmakers, that class of Watergate babies who would shape public policy well into the next century. We have come to understand many facets of this larger story only with time, which was a big part of the motivation of writing my book. And what we now sort of understand with Watergate is that it was not just the burglary on June 17th, 1972, and the subsequent cover-up. But in many ways, Watergate is better understood not as an event, but as a mindset. It's an umbrella for about a dozen distinct and interrelated but separate scandals. The Chenault affair, the Houston plan, the Kissinger wiretaps and the illegal bombing of Cambodia, the Pentagon Papers, the ITT and the Dita Beard memo, the Vesco donation, milk price fixing, campaign dirty tricks, Spiro Agnew's bribery case, the FBI's co-intel operations, plus just a little bit of presidential tax fraud. In fact, many people forget that Nixon's most famous line from the Watergate scandals, "I am not a crook," came not because of the Watergate scandals, but because of the associated and concurrent tax investigations. Some of these other associated scandals would be monumental in their own right. The still opaque Chenault affair represents one of the only instances of credible allegations in U.S. history of key political figures meddling in foreign affairs, and the first ever resignation of a vice president, Nixon's Spiro Agnew, came amid a scandal that under normal circumstances would have been more serious than any other scandal that has touched the White House in 240 years. To me, across all of it, Watergate is the greatest story ever told about power, the need for it, the drive to protect it, how it is challenged, and how it flows month to month in a city governed by well-calibrated checks and balances. It also explains the deeper functions and purpose of government and the delicate ballet and interplay of the different parts of the Constitution, the way that the checks and balances of Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 came together with the Bill of Rights to enable the Washington and its institutions to force a criminal and corrupt president from office and ensure a smooth, functioning democracy. Gerald Ford's ascension to the presidency in August 1974 was one of the most dramatic chapters in U.S. history. But to me, what is so fascinating about it, and part of why it is so resonant with us still, is how that event, in many ways, was so undramatic. That continuity of government, that succession of presidential power happened in such a organized way as Frank laid out. I'm pleased to have the chance to talk with you all today and look forward to the conversation as a panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Garrett. I think as we go throughout time and we get more perspectives, different opinions on Watergate, on Richard Nixon, that's made possible by the passage of time, as you say, but also the opening of those archives that Jason's talking about. And researchers like yourself and others can go in, and I'm sure we'll see many, many new books come out, new perspectives over the coming years. I know when I was an archivist and director of presidential libraries, I kind of had the feeling that you had going in looking at those primary documents. You kind of get those tingles, those goosebumps of looking at things like drafts of the Tear Down This Wall speech at Reagan, or I remember the notes that President Bush made immediately after 9/11 of seeing that history being made on paper right in front of you. So really just fascinating. Now, so thank you very much, Garrett. And now we're going to hear from Bob Bostock. Bob is the consultant for the Richard Nixon Foundation. And when the private Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Birthplace opened in 1990, as you heard, Bob had worked with President Nixon to write the exhibits about the Nixon presidency, including the original Watergate exhibit. He knows well the personal perspective of the president on the resignation and how he thought that decision should be presented to the public. So with that, turn over to Bob Bostock.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to bring the discussion back to the topic of today's panel, which is August 8th, 1974. I have a tangential connection to the White House on August 8th, 1974. I was a 16-year-old teenager living in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. In 1972, I had volunteered on phone banks for the Bergen County Committee to reelect the president. in New Jersey and had been active with a group that was opposing efforts to impeach the president in 1974. On August 8th, 1974, I watched the Today Show, and Bruce Hershenson, who Frank mentioned earlier, had appeared on the show, and he expressed his belief that the president should not and would not resign in his speech that evening. I was moved to call the White House after seeing Mr. Hershenson on television to express my support to him for what he had said on the TV show earlier that day. I was called the White House, long distance call, which back then, you were billed for that. And, I knew when my dad saw the phone bill, when it came later, I'd have to answer, why am I calling Washington? But I got through to Mr. Hershenson's office, and I was talking to his administrative assistant and giving her a little bit about my background. And she asked me to hold for a second. And Bruce Hershenson came on the line himself. And I told him my thoughts, that I really appreciated what he had said on the television earlier that day, and that I hoped he was right. And the call then ended after just a couple of minutes. And of course, later that day, the president did announce his resignation. 2 days later, on August 10th, I received in the mail a special delivery package from the White House. Very surprised by that. And inside was a letter from Mr. Hershenson, and I think we have an image of that on a slide. And the letter said, "Dear Bob, the president wanted you to have these as a memento. He is aware of your hard work and loyalty. Thanks, too, for your telephone call today. It meant a great deal to all of us here. And more important, it means a great deal to the president. Respectfully, Bruce Hershenson, Deputy Special Assistant to the President." And inside this small package was a pair of cufflinks, and I think we have an image of that, pair of cufflinks with the presidential seal, and a tie bar with the presidential seal and the president's signature on the bar. And that was quite something for me. It was really, really amazing to receive that. And I was really struck by the fact, particularly in the years since, to think that on a day when everything in the West Wing had pretty much ground to a halt, and people were just, as Frank expressed earlier, kind of on a death watch, waiting to see what was going to happen that evening, that an aide to the president would not only take a call from some teenager up in New Jersey, but would then have the kindness and consideration to send me a letter and these two mementos of the Nixon presidency. I suspect there are not a lot of letters that came out of the White House dated August 8th, 1974, and I'm kind of really happy to have one of what I suspect are very few. So if we fast forward 16 years, I was, or 15 years, the summer of 1989, right after I'd finished my graduate degree and before I was ready to go down to Washington to take a job working on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress from New Jersey. I had spent the summer interning in President Nixon's office in Woodcliff Lake, New Jersey, just a few minutes, 20-minute drive maybe from my house. And I had spent that summer fact-checking his 8th book, In the Arena. And at the end of my time there, I bade farewell to the president. We had a brief meeting. He gave me autographed copies of all his previous books. And I went on my way down to Washington to start my new job. Well, in March of 1990, I got a call from the president's chief of staff who said to me, "Bob, we need you to take a leave of absence from your job and come up and write for the Nixon Library that was going to open in July 1990, the story of the Nixon presidency. The writers that the designers had hired really don't get Nixon, and we're desperate to have you come up here and finish the writing." And finish the writing was everything from right after the 1962 campaign for governor of California all the way through to the original, or to the Watergate exhibit, which was going to be the final exhibit in the library. So fortunately, my boss, after he received a call from President Nixon saying, "If you don't let Bostock take a leave of absence, my library is not going to open on time," I began spending 4 days a week up in Woodcliff Lake, and then a day down in Washington answering the constituent mail that had come into my boss. I worked on all these exhibits. It was a very intense time. It was a lot of 12-hour days. I knew I was going to have to write the Watergate exhibit. I saved it for last because I was really dreading it. I was 32 years old. I wasn't really looking forward to writing the story for his library about the events that ended his presidency. But as it came time for me to get working on that exhibit, I was sitting at my desk and I heard someone at the door to my office, and it was the president. So I jumped up and walked around my desk and said, "Mr. President, what can I do for you?" And he said to me, he said, "Bob, I understand you're getting to write the last exhibit." Didn't call it the Watergate exhibit, just called it the last exhibit. I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Well, what do you intend to do?" I said, "Well, sir, my feeling is that it's your name on the building. We ought to tell the story from your perspective." And he said, "That's exactly right." And he kind of turned on his heel and walked back to his office. So I got writing the story from his perspective. And one of the benefits I had was he gave me access to notes that he took every day of his presidency. During the day, he would jot little things down to remind him when he was going to dictate his diary later that day. So I had to go through all 5.5 years. I didn't have to, but there was no way I was not going to go through these notes. And eventually came to the period beginning June 17th, 1972, the date of the Watergate break-in, the second Watergate break-in, when the burglars were arrested. And the first note I saw regarding Watergate was on June 19th, 1972. The president had been in Key Biscayne over the weekend, and he had returned to the White House later in the day on June 19th. And he wrote a note, and we should have an image of that as well. And with lots of, if you go two more, I think we're a little out of order. Now the next one. This is the one. The first reference to Watergate in these notes was, and you can see it as the third thing down, H, meaning Haldeman, check EOB for bugs. He was concerned that his office in the executive office building, which was an informal space that he often used to do his thinking and writing, might be bugged. So they wanted to make sure that that was not bugged. And then as I went through the notes, interestingly, I didn't see another reference to anything about Watergate until March 21st, 1973, when John Dean came in and told the president what he thought the president ought to know about how this whole Watergate thing was unfolding. And on that note, he had written Dean, Cancer on Presidency. And then I saw, as I continued to go through the notes, more and more references to Watergate. And I got the distinct impression that the president was really trying to find out what was going on so that he could deal with it. He had asked John Dean to go to Camp David and write a report on what he knew. Dean never wrote that report because it would implicate him in a lot of things that were potentially criminal. So Nixon was trying, as these notes revealed, to really find out what was going on. And nobody was telling him the whole story at all. And he was really struggling to figure out what was going on. That was certainly my impression from the notes. But eventually, as I finished going through the notes, I wrote the exhibit, and we have the image of that cover page of my 28-page draft of the exhibit, which I think we can bring that up. I was really nervous about giving him the text while being in New Jersey, rather. So I had finished it on a Tuesday, I think, but I gave it to his administrative assistant to give to him on my way out the door on Thursday, because I didn't really want to be around when he went through this exhibit, because I had no idea how he was going to respond. So I got a call the following day on Friday from his administrative assistant, and she told me, "Bob, the president's going to call you tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. He wants to discuss your draft of the Watergate exhibit." So after a sleepless night, Saturday morning at precisely 11 o'clock, the phone rang, and I was put much at ease when the president said, "Bob, I think this is a brilliant presentation." And he wrote that across the top of that document that was on the screen a minute ago. And as I went through the draft, he was making edits and corrections and suggestions on almost every single page of the draft. Nothing was really left untouched by him until we got to what was the last page in the draft, which would be the next slide, which was covering the resignation and his departure from the White House. You can see that there are no notations, no edits, no suggestions at all on this page, which was pretty unusual for the entire draft of the exhibit. I found that we also, as we worked on the exhibit and got to the point where we had to select the photographs that would go in the exhibit about the final days of the Nixon presidency, the president did not want to look at those photographs 16 years after the event. He had a practice of looking at all the other photographs we had selected for the rest of the exhibits, but he said, I don't need to see them. You just pick the ones that you think are best. The Monday after I had given the draft in, and 2 days after the call, I got into the office and was told immediately the president wanted to meet with me. So I met with him in his office, and we went over the draft in great detail. And he addressed all of the questions that he had in the draft and the comments that he had in an incredibly dispassionate way. It struck me that when he first asked me about writing the exhibit, he called it the last exhibit. But when it came time to review the draft, he put his lawyer's hat on and he stepped away from the events. And it was almost as if we were talking about something that had happened to somebody else. And with a very clear and dispassionate eye, we went through the draft, and eventually, in a time or two, we got it finalized and sent off to the designers to be able to put all the text and the photographs and everything else we had into the actual exhibit. A couple months later, at the opening of the library the night before, on June 18th, 1990, there was a reception for people who had supported the library and had given donations and others. And my wife and I were out there, and we were invited to the reception. And afterwards, the president had spoken to everybody in the auditorium at the library. And afterwards, he had a receiving line. And as we were going through the line, I got up to him and shook his hand, and he said, "Bob, how do you like the museum?" And I said, "Mr. President, I think it's great." And he said, "Well, you oughta. You wrote the damn thing," and kind of clapped me on the shoulder. And Bob, then a little later at the reception,
what an amazing experience that was, Bob. I know we have our panel questions coming up, but I think
I have about 30 seconds left, if I might.
Please go right ahead, please. Yes.
Thank you, Alan. And then later in the evening, one of the members of the president's family came up to me and told me how the president had conducted them through the whole museum. And when they got to the Watergate section, he just said, "Bostock wrote this, it's fine." And they walked right on through without spending any time in that section. So as I look back on 50 years on this date and also back to the experience of writing that exhibit, it's just, I find it to be an extraordinary event and experience in my own life. But also having the opportunity to work with those notes that he took every day of his presidency really gave me an insight that I think other researchers and scholars have not had the opportunity to see, because those notes were his private property and not included in the records at the Nixon Library. So thank you, Alan, for giving me an extra minute. I did for 30 seconds, and you gave me a minute, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You used the word extraordinary, and that is exactly that experience. Of really, just all from a long distance phone call. That's terrific. And I must say, I saw that original Watergate exhibit, and just an important document. I think an important snapshot, as you said, of his perspective, said through you, of that momentous time in our nation's history. So thank you, Bob, very much for that. Thank you, all panelists, so much. First, I want to turn now to all of you and ask a couple questions, as we have a little bit of time left. You've all either used or helped process Nixon presidential material. So what advice for the folks out there, if they want to do research on the resignation, on any issue, frankly, from the Nixon administration, what advice would you have for those wanting to come in and utilize those records, or how best to utilize those records at the Nixon Presidential Library?
So, Alan,
Jason, turn to you first.
as the supervisory archivist, and it's a pretty simple answer to just get in touch with our archives team out in Yorba Linda. Collectively, we have over a century of experience working with the collection. Our research room is open 9:30 to 4, Monday through Friday, except for federal holidays. Since COVID, we've had a researcher appointment system that's worked out really well because researchers have a virtual consultation with an archivist to find out what they want to look at when they're out with us, and we can get the first card of materials pulled for them in advance so they can hit the ground running. And although the collection is vast, it can be surprisingly easy to find things. And I have a quick personal example in my own nexus to the resignation. 10 years ago, I was buying a car here locally, and we got to the finance portion, and the salesman asked me what I did, and I said, I'm an archivist. And he said, what's that? So I explained the work that we do at the Nixon Library, and he perked up and said, oh, the Nixon Library, you've probably seen my picture. And it's true that we have a lot of pictures. I wasn't quite sure how to respond. But he went on to explain that he was a Marine, and from 1971 to 1974, he was stationed at the White House. And on the day of the resignation, he was one of the military folks at the base of the helicopter. And so I pulled up the picture, and he pointed himself out and then explained that he and another Marine had also written to the president supporting his effort on POWs. And I was able to go into our alphabetical name file to find a copy of the letter, which led me cross-reference to our subject files. And he was kind of emotional about seeing the letter again after all these years. And it just speaks to the millions of personal stories that make up the collection.
Sure. I know, Bob and Frank, you've used them, you've helped create them sometimes. What about your experiences in diving into those, as I said, raw material of history?
I think the advice, if I might, that I would give to any researcher is turn every page and don't go in with a preconceived notion of what you're going to find, and just look for the things that are going to support whatever your view might be going in. It's such a rich archive. I know on special exhibits that I have worked on here for the Nixon Library, you go in and you ask for some boxes, and you may think you're looking for one particular thing, but if you turn every page in there, you find amazing kind of treasures almost that you would never have expected to find, but they kind of pop out of nowhere almost, it seems, that give you a new perspective or a new way of thinking about particular events that took place and that you're researching. So I think if you turn every page and go in there with a very open mind and not just look at one portion of the archives, but look at as many things, whether it's from the presidential daily diary to memos that were written during that period and all those other things that give you a richer and more complete picture of whatever was going on and whatever you were researching at that particular time.
I can second Jason's advice of just do it, because I just did it about a month ago. For the first time in 50 years, I went in, filled out the form, got a reader's ticket, and got to take a trip down memory lane through some of my papers, which were delivered in a very timely manner. And of course, everybody is, as Jason says, there's thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. So everybody is knowledgeable, and it's a seamless experience, and it's just something to do. Jason also mentioned earlier when we were doing the memoirs. It was before we joined the National Archives, and Jason mentioned the suit, and so the president was challenging the suit, was challenging the ownership of the papers, but we had an exquisite dilemma because we had to finish the memoirs and we needed access to the papers, and he when he resigned, he had $500,000 in legal bills. And so he had to do something to pay that now that he was a private citizen. And so the obvious thing was to sign a contract for a book and do some television, which he did. And that got him the money to pay the lawyers or to bring him up to date. And then the lawyers gave him their best advice, which was, for God's sake, don't write a book and don't do anything on television, because then you're committed to it. So it was, what would it be, 48 years ago or 52 years ago. Math was not my strong point. In July of 76, I went back and to go through the papers, and I was in a room in the EOB with an armed Secret Service policeman. I was at a table and they were opposite me, an armed Secret Service policeman, a representative of the archives, and a representative of President Ford's counsel's office. And papers were brought out to me, and I would just check. I couldn't use any pen or anything, and I would just tick. I would request the paper. So they copied 35,000 or 36,000 sheets of paper that were then transported out to San Clemente, and that's how we worked on the memoirs. But so it's now much easier to do, and for scholars and even for citizens, if you're just interested, like the Marine in question, it's as Nixon was, as Garrett says, and as we all, and as you began, Alan, Nixon's a pivotal figure in the 20th century, and into the influence into the 21st century. So he rewards study.
Yes, I remember years ago reading the memoirs and reading In the Arena. So thank you both for your efforts in those books. And Garrett, you have a recent experience utilizing, obviously, many presidential libraries, including the Nixon archives. Can you tell us a bit about that experience?
Yeah, I would, second or third or quadruple, I guess, at this point, the point that Jason raised, which is, making the most of any presidential library or really any archive I've ever worked in begins with a very, open and fruitful conversation with, the archivist or supervisory archivist. A lot of presidential libraries have archivists who sort of specialize in certain topics. And I have one sort of very strong memory from when I was working on an earlier book about the presidential doomsday plans and continuity of government efforts, and was down at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, and explaining to the archivist there who worked on national security issues sort of what I wanted. And he said, "Oh, you want the furtherance file?" And I was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And he's like, "Those programs in the Johnson years were codenamed furtherance," which, to Bob's point, the archivist had only learned because he had just sort of paged through every folder in all of the boxes. And, as a researcher coming into that library, the only thing that I would have had no clue that was the folder that I wanted, because in the finding aid, it's just listed under F as furtherance folder. And he had, the archivist had gone through all of the work to, get that folder declassified and opened to the public. But I find the archivists just an enormous wealth of knowledge and history about what their collections actually entail. And then sort of, very much related, to me, the strength of the presidential archives and libraries is also that they are a network. The details that we have about the Chenault affair, and that sort of Nixon scandal in the 68 campaign actually came out of the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library. And it's only been within the last 10 to 15 years that those documents were ultimately declassified, and we were able to piece together that portion of Nixon's presidency thanks to the documents in the Johnson Library. And of course, for anyone doing research on Nixon, of course, the Ford Library in Ann Arbor is also an enormous wealth of Nixon adjacent material as well.
I assume a trip to Abilene for the Eisenhower Library as well. But I could talk all day about the amazing resources, not just of the records, but of the archivists themselves at the presidential libraries. I want to get, though, to our second panel question about the perspectives on the Nixon resignation. We can hear many different perspectives on Watergate, on Nixon. We've heard a couple of those here today. But looking at the resignation specifically, how do you think the public and the scholarly perspectives have changed or not changed over the 50 years? And did President Nixon's views of the resignation change between that day and further on in his life? Perhaps, can we start with that personal perspective first with Frank and Bob? Do you know, in terms of from the day of the resignation and leaving to the end of his life, do you know, did that change at all?
It was as abhorrent to every instinct in his body in April 1994 when he died as it was in August of 1974 when he resigned. As he said in my interviews, it was the least appealing thing to him. So no, I don't think I think the view of history, distance has lent a certain amount of enchantment, and a lot of perspective and context has been added. Apropos the Chenault, Madame Chenault, there's a recent book which was chosen by the Wall Street Journal this last year as, I think, the best history book of the year. Luke Nichter, who's a professor at Chapman University, called 1968, The Year That Broke Politics, I think it's called. But I think that is the definitive, that's the definitive work on the question on Chenault. Thinking about 1974, there are two about these events. There are two books that I can think of that convey the flavor of the time. One is Elizabeth Drew's I think it's called Washington Journal, and she wrote at the time in 73 and 4, and she might have done it even before. But I think she even says it began with Watergate. She wrote a weekly column for the New Yorker, and she was just a terrific reporter and observer. And she gets a lot right, which is remarkable given that the administration was so closed-mouthed. And But she conveys the tenor of the times. It's really, if you were there, it's really something. And then John Osborne, who was a reporter, just a storied guy and a really nice guy for the New Republic, and he wrote a weekly column called The Nixon Watch, and they were accumulated into 4 or 5 volumes. The first year, second year of the Nixon Watch, and the last year, which I guess is the 6th year of the Nixon Watch, weekly. He this really informed and thoughtful and smart and well-connected reporter writes about it. And so I think those, for contemporary books, they're hard. I don't think they have many rivals, and they're hard to beat.
Yeah, I would agree with Frank that the president's view of the resignation did not change up until the end of his life. Certainly, it hadn't changed when I was working on the original Watergate exhibit in 1990. But I think over the past 50 years, I think what has really changed is that impeachment, which in 1974 was something that hadn't happened to a president in more than 100 years. And it was seen as this very sober kind of constitutional process. But I think as people look back at that entire era, and now we have seen President Clinton impeached and gone to trial in the Senate and acquitted, President Trump twice impeached, gone to trial in the Senate twice and acquitted both times, once while he was still in office and once while he had left office, that people see now, I think, that impeachment is really a political act. Gerald Ford once said well before the impeachment effort against President Nixon was underway, that impeachment is whatever the majority of the Congress says it is at any particular time. And I think over the past 50 years, and particularly I would say probably over the past 25 years or so, people's view of impeachment has changed from being this very sober constitutional correction sort of thing to a political act. And I think people now are looking back at many people now are looking back at the effort to impeach President Nixon, and they're seeing it through that lens. Garrett spoke earlier about, it's about power and the desire for power and to hold onto it. And that's what's interesting about impeachments, both in 1974 and the subsequent ones. It's not just a one-sided effort to hold on to power and maintain it. Those who are often opposing the president are seeking to gain power that they had not necessarily won through the ballot box. So I think that has really changed our perspective on impeachment and efforts to impeach over the past 50 years.
So I'm sorry to end it at that. We could go on for many hours. A fascinating discussion. I thank you all so much, panelists, for being with us today. I think, the resignation of a president that took place 50 years ago still obviously affects our body politic in many ways. And the better I think we understand it, the nuances of it, the different perspectives on it, the rippled effects that we're still feeling, the better we stand ready to face the future. So I want to thank you all again very much. And now we're fortunate, I do believe, to have a message from the director of the Gerald Ford Presidential Library Museum, Brooke Clement.
Hello, I am Brooke Clement, director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, where we've been live streaming this event in both our auditoriums in Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's been our pleasure to partner with our colleagues at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library on this program. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to future partnering opportunities between our two libraries. Friends for over 20 years, the Fords and Nixons demanded a peaceful transition between administrations. There was no gloating, no victory laps. Then Republican National Committee Chairperson George H.W. Bush wrote in his diary of this historic transition, and then the whole mood changed. It was quiet, respectful, sorrowful in one sense, but upbeat. Researchers can learn more about this monumental event in American history at the National Archives and its Nixon and Ford and Bush presidential libraries. We are honored and privileged to preserve these records for posterity. This program is just one of many produced by National Archives staff that elevates these histories and records. The Ford Library and Museum is hosting programming this week too, and we hope you consider joining us virtually for these events. This evening and tomorrow midday, Mike and Steve Ford, Carla Hills, and Major General Albert Zapanta will be discussing the events of August 8th and 9th, 1974, and their eyewitness accounts of these days. For more information on how to watch these programs, please visit our website, fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now I'll hand it back over to Tamara Martin to wrap things up for us.
Thank you, Brooke. And Tamara, if you don't mind, I'll say just a quick word of thanks to Brooke. I'm very proud of her. She was the supervisory archivist when I was director of the George W. Bush Library and Museum, and she's doing great work in Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor. If you all haven't been to Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor to see the museum, the Ford Museum and the library, you should go right away. I think we're very fortunate to have had Gerald Ford in the position he was in for our nation. So again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all who took part today. And Tamara Martin, I'll pass the microphone back to you.
Great. Thank you, Alan, for moderating today's discussion focused on President Nixon's decision to resign, his final days at the White House, and the Nixon Presidential Materials Collection that's available here at the library. I also wanted to take a moment to thank our panelists, Frank Gannon, Jason Schultz, Garrett Graff, and Bob Bostock, and a special thank you to Kara Blond and Brooke Clement for their remarks. We also wanted to extend our thanks to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum and to the National Archives and Records Administration Theater in Washington, D.C. for streaming today's programs at their locations. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the hard work of the Nixon Library staff and our other partners for your contributions to today's program. We also want to acknowledge our appreciation for our partnership and continued collaboration with the Richard Nixon Foundation. Richard Nixon's presidency is one of the most extensively documented administrations in American history. As you heard in our program today, the Nixon Library is home to approximately 46 million pages of textual records, of which approximately 20 million are currently open and available for research. There are also hundreds of thousands of other audiovisual records and artifacts in the collection. As Jason mentioned, the National Archives staff at the Nixon Library continue to systematically review and open records to broaden access to the public. If you are interested to learn more about President Nixon or records referenced in today's program, please contact our team at nixonreference@nara.gov. Each year, we welcome thousands of visitors to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, and we invite you to come see us in sunny Yorba Linda, California. On your visit, you will have the opportunity to learn more about the 37th President of the United States, his administration, and his ongoing impact on the world. Currently, our special exhibit is The Ancient World, Unlocking the Middle East. This exhibit, in partnership with the Richard Nixon Foundation, acknowledges the conclusion of the Yom Kippur War and President Nixon's subsequent trip to the Middle East in 1974. This exhibit is open until July 6, 2025. To learn more about this, other public programming, or to plan your visit to see us, please go to www.nixonlibrary.gov. Thank you again for joining us today, and we wish you a good afternoon.